Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this virtual PISM seminar on the challenges that the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is facing. We'll focus mostly on economic reconstruction and climate. We have a special guest today. It's Minister of Climate and Environment, Michał Kurtyka. Let me just start off by saying telling you a couple of housekeeping notes that we want to abide by. We are live streamed on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. We will have a conversation among us with the Minister and with Damian Mazur for the first probably 50 minutes, and then, or maybe 40-50 minutes, and then we will also take questions from you, the audience. So please make sure to ask those questions so that we can see them. You can do it either in the chat box in YouTube, or you can do it by messaging us on Twitter, or you can do it in a comment on Facebook. We really welcome your thoughts and questions. Mr. Minister, welcome to our seminar. We're having this discussion and this talk about the challenges facing the OECD for two reasons. One is that we thought at the Institute, at PISM, that there's a niche in our work. We haven't focused much on the organization. We haven't talked about it. Perhaps there's a lack of information about it in the Polish public debate, and probably even a European public debate. And the second reason why we're having this discussion is because you are our candidate, the Polish candidate, for the position of the Secretary General of the OECD. And we wanted to draw you out a little bit on your plans and your vision for the organization. So this is what we'll be talking about. Before we get down to business, to our conversation, among the two of us, I wanted to ask Damian Mazur, who is our analyst in the Asia Pacific program and who deals with the OECD and analyzes the issues that the OECD does too, to give us an introduction about the organization, perhaps not only about the challenges that the OECD faces, but some basic info so that we have a background and our viewers have a background about what we'll be talking about. Damian, over to you.
Thank you, Patricia. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to make a short introduction of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an intergovernmental organization created by the convention signed in Paris on 14th of December 1960. So in a month's time, we'll have a 60th anniversary of signing of the document. It entered into force in 1961, and this is the official date of the establishment of the OECD. And the OECD is the successor of the other organization, Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which is important for Europe because it managed the Marshall Plan after the World War II. OECD's main aim is to promote the economic growth and raise the living standards all over the world, but especially in its 37 member states, which are developed market economies and democracies. These are two criteria that the member states have to meet. They are from Europe, North and South America, and the Asia-Pacific region, and they account for about 62% of global GDP, more than 60% of global trade, but only about 17% of the world's population. Poland became the member of the OECD in 1996, and what is important, it was the first Western integration organization that Poland joined after the 1989. OECD mainly performs advisory information functions and also carries out socio-economic analysis, including peer review between the member states. The organization is also a forum for exchanging views, opinions on global matters, also experience and good practices between member states, but also non-member countries, and also a place where international standards are set. For instance, OECD established rules regarding development aid, export credits, tax avoidance. Currently, there is an ongoing discussion on the digital taxation, competition, investment, and anti-corruption measures. That is why the OECD is perceived as one of the pillars of the global economic governance system. And the Secretary General position is important for the OECD's activity. This person proposes the directions for the development of the organization and also the areas which the OECD should focus on. He or she chairs the main body of the organization, the OECD Council, and also heads the OECD Secretariat, which coordinates the day-to-day work of the organization. And the Secretary General also represents organization outside in relations with partner countries, including key states like China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and also other international organizations like the World Bank. And the new Secretary General must face several significant challenges. I will name only 3 of them. First is, of course, the economic recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic, as the crisis will aggravate the problems of inequality or poverty in many countries all over the world. Second, combating climate change, biodiversity decline, and environmental degradation. And 3, setting global rules for the modern economy, involving such issues as artificial intelligence, but also digitalization and data protection. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damian. Thanks for giving us this background. Mr. Minister, you're no stranger to our Polish public, but just for the sake of information about you, I wanted to tell our viewers a couple of things from your resume, which I found just mind-blowing. You were educated in Paris at the École Polytechnique. You went on a scholarship to study quantum optics at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Gaithersburg in Maryland, the US. There you worked with a Nobel laureate in physics, William Phillips. And then you also studied economics there with another Nobel Prize laureate for economics, Jean Tirole. Then you also studied international economics at the University in Louvain, La Neuve in Belgium. And you obtained your master's and your doctoral title from the University of Warsaw. You also worked as in the office of the Committee for European Integration. So you were one of those people who put Poland in the European Union, which I think is important for our generation. And this is just by way of saying that you are really very well suited to tackle the issue of recovery. You yourself recovered from COVID recently. So, Mr. Minister, I want to ask you about your program and your vision should you become the Secretary General of the OECD. I want to start off with one phrase that you're using in the program that you reiterated in front of the OECD member states. You're using the phrase build back better, that we need to build back better. This is incidentally, or maybe on purpose, the same wording that Joe Biden, the US president-elect, is using when he is talking about recovery in the US. Joe Biden means fighting social exclusion, racism, and creating green economy. What do you mean by this phrase, to build back better?
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you, Damian, for this introduction. And I'm very grateful for you to manage this workshop. And it's my pleasure to welcome everybody as we are going to speak about most urgent and important matters for our societies, for our economies. And I truly believe that OECD can play absolutely a fundamental, a pivotal role in the way we rethink our world after the pandemic. Indeed, I have participated just 2 weeks ago in OECD Ministerial Council meeting, and most of the participating ministers, if not all, urged to build back better in their interventions during the discussion. And I think that to build back better can mean very different things in various contexts. but one it has in common, it is the understanding that the pandemic ravaged our ways of living, and the whole new start will be needed. And this is why I have proposed to spur a new growth, to put our economies back on track, not rebuilding exactly one-to-one the model that we inherited already now, and which during the pandemic time also shows its weaknesses. We need to rethink our economies, our societies, and bring a different solution. And I think that we should use also the opportunity which is provided to us by recovery plans, so that we prepare our economies and societies for the challenges of the future related to going digital and green, as well as encompass long-term standing challenges of social inequalities, intergenerational solidarity, empowering women or aging societies. And it has been in many elements already mentioned by Damian. So what I'm putting at the heart of this proposal is aligning traditional notion of GDP growth with improved well-being, and somehow take back control over global trends revealed by the COVID-19 pandemic. This is why I have proposed a new growth agenda, and part of this agenda is linked with the fact that we cannot continue as it was previously, and we should use somehow the opportunity of not thinking in yesterday terms, but to think beyond the immediate and somehow be able to create economies, infrastructures, business models, societies, rule-based economic model of global economy, and make it resilient for future shocks. This is what I meant by using this term. And again, it's not an unfamiliar term in the context of OECD.
Right. So you mentioned a couple of issues that sort of interplay in this new model. There are social inequalities. Surely there is climate change, or fighting climate change there too. And I want to ask about that. So in your message to the OECD member states, you mentioned, and I quote here, 80% of global energy supply today is still fossil, just as it was 30 years ago, end of quote. So it is a real challenge, obviously, to the sustainable development model. How to change the global energy mix and at the same time improve living standards of people in the transition period, the energy transition period, especially in countries, that are highly dependent on fossils. So and then the question is, because it's a broad question, the question is how the OECD can contribute, to gather public and private funds for green investments.
Well, I think that a strategy to change global energy mix should be based on the development of new technologies aligned with climate goals. And such technologies are a chance for us to drive long-term investments. And indeed, the issues which we can see as weaknesses, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, climate change, all this can be addressed if we put our bets on right technologies, and if we are able somehow to steer our systems and our economies in the right direction. But this requires a lot of knowledge. And I think in this regard, OECD, which is an evidence-based organization, is the right place to provide guidance for member states on how to achieve their goals with the best, most cost-effective solutions, but also the ones which will find the most of social acceptance. As we must also take into account the fact that OECD is the place in international economic order, where when we discuss issues linked with education, with taxation, with healthcare. All this is linked with climate change, and all this is linked with technologies which can be brought forward in order to find a solution to ongoing problems. And the idea, the challenge is that we do not continue locking in unsustainable infrastructures in technologies of yesterday, but we build resilient infrastructures for tomorrow, that we find ways to develop innovative business models, and that we also combine the forces of OECD member states. And Damian spoke about it. 62% of world's GDP is inside OECD. So we can work in order to make these technologies scalable. And once they will be scalable and in the market, it can be also a solution for third countries, for non-member states of OECD. And I value very much solidarity. It's also a principle which has been put forward at the COP24 in Katowice. And I had the pleasure and the privilege to run this COP24, which ended up in adoption of Katowice rulebook. That's quite an impressive 100 pages document, which we created on a consensual base by 196 countries. And I'm confident that right now we are able to build together new growth agenda, which will be making the right use of new technologies and which will help to solve the challenge of using fossil fuels. And we should recognize that by now, major economies are declaring their will to go that way. And this year brings, and especially in last months and weeks, brings a lot of very important decisions going in this direction.
Thanks. I'm tempted to ask more questions about it, but I already see that we have questions coming in from our viewers and a couple of really important issues to raise with you. So maybe I'll continue with the problems that are seen in the public debate and on the international scene following the pandemic. These are three really important issues. Economic nationalism. Well, you can call it economic nationalism. It can be nationalism together with various aspects of it, political and economic, but it's a problem. And I wonder what your solution to that would be. Problem number two, deglobalization, or all those calls to curb down globalization or change it, reform it, or make it a regional. So how do you see deglobalization as a term and as a risk, or maybe it should be taken on board and somehow rethought? And then the third big international problem, the US-China rivalry. The OECD would have to deal with it somehow, with all three. So what are your thoughts on these?
Well, I think that first, the OECD is a community of like-minded nations which cherishes democratic values and market economy. And strong involvement of state in the economy is not something controversial in these special circumstances, even for the OECD member states. And I think in this regard, we have also learned our lessons of the 2008 economic crisis, where fiscal austerity only deepened fiscal imbalances in the long run, depressed overall demand, and failed to cushion the lack of investment and cash holding. So crisis of this magnitude in the short term requires providing liquidity for our economies to stay afloat. And I think that we are also in this the same kind of configuration for COVID-19 recovery. We hope to find a solution in terms of health We can be happy of the recent announcement by companies that a vaccine can be ready. But economic and social consequences of this pandemic are still largely unpredictable and probably will be long-standing. So how can we rebuild trust in international trade? How can we make sure that fragmented value chain due to restricted mobility are not interrupted for good? How can we make sure that we come back with an uninterrupted flow of ideas and services around the globe? And they will be more than necessary if we want this recovery to be sustainable. And if we want, as soon as possible also, to come back to business as usual. And I think that it's obvious now that the pandemic amplified so many problems that we have observed and tried to tackle before the outbreak of the pandemic. And globalization, of course, needs to be used as an effective tool in hands of member states, in hands for the global community to increase well-being of everybody. And I think that many member states will agree with you that we need to regain trust and rebuild confidence in the world right now. And I think that for OECD, of course, it's an organization which is not meant to be universal in terms of its membership. The key issue will be to maintain a balance between its integrity, its core values, and strengthening these core values and being also a pole of attraction for other countries, but also recognizing changing patterns of the world economy. 25 years ago, when my country joined OECD, Poland was only a very small economy. It has risen during these 30 years and has become much more wealthy. But this is the case for many emerging economies. And especially in this regard, we have to recognize what distance has been achieved by Asian countries. And I think that having the right approach between making OECD an organization which truly believes in its core values and at the same time it's able to spread its message and to influence global economic order is the challenge which requires a lot of attention, a lot of balance, but I'm confident that we can achieve it.
Mr. Minister, I will need to press you a little bit on one issue, which is the US-China rivalry, or for that matter, any great power rivalry. Do you see a role for the OECD in the global geopolitical, geostrategic rivalries at all? Or you think the organization should, as much as it can, remain out of it?
Well, you cannot remain completely out of it. This is what I said. During the last 30 years, economic paysage changed completely in terms of structural distribution of wealth and in terms of growing economies, and China is leading, of course, in this regard. I truly believe that when we have rules-based economic order that we develop at OECD, it can be a very powerful tool which can serve to attract other member states by showing them how this framework can be job-rich, can create value. And if we want, and I think that all member states would agree that trade is a factor of benefits, that trade is building value, is building wealth, is building trust among nations. then we need to use this framework also to attract other economies, such as China. And I value very much the cooperation which is already ongoing at the OECD with key partners. It's not only China, it's India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa. These are important countries where cooperations are established, and we must always keep the right balance in terms of bringing value for member states of OECD and at the same time providing opportunities and providing a model which will be attractive to other countries. And of course, you mentioned US-China relation. I have been very much engaged in solving particularly complicated issues of in the context of international dialogue. During COP24, we struck a compromise on many fields between Europe, US, and China, which is part of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we found a way to build a level playing field for climate policy starting from 2021, as Katowice rulebook will in fact replace the Kyoto Protocol and will serve as the implementing rulebook for the Paris Agreement starting from the 1st of January of 2021. And so we had this ability to find a compromise even in this very complicated matter, which was implementing the Paris Agreement. And I'm confident that once we have concrete issues, once we are dealing with future-oriented technologies, with new solutions, we will be able also to find solutions for global economy inside OECD and with key OECD partners.
Thank you. Speaking about the future-oriented technologies, I wanted to ask you about practical solutions on the global scale that you see the OECD should advocate in the areas that will be the backbone of future economies, such as digitalization, 5G, artificial intelligence, automation. So what are these practical solutions that the OECD should advocate, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I think that we are sharing all this climate challenge. And OECD, one of an important OECD work methods is called horizontal projects to address topics that go far beyond specific policy areas and have both positive and negative spillover effects on others. And one of an interesting applications of this horizontal project has been for OECD delivering for the past 4 years analysis and advice how digital transformation will shape labor market, education, systems, healthcare, enterprises, and consumers. And I think that we are moving and we are maturing also that OECD could be the place where such a horizontal analysis could be performed around climate challenge and climate-related technologies, because that is touching a lot of issues at which OECD is absolutely fantastic at. So we have structural reforms, taxation, industry, but we have also satellite organizations in the family of OECD. We have International Energy Agency, we have Transport Forum, we have International Atomic Energy Agency. And if we put all this knowledge together and if we apply the work method of OECD, which is evidence-based, but which is also seeking for consensual solutions among member states, and that we are able to drive together this challenge of climate policy and the greening of our economies for the benefit of all. So I truly believe that we can have a very meaningful impact on starting with this agenda. You mentioned, of course, digital, and I think that we should continue around digital discussion, how to make sure that digital is also working for the benefit of everybody. And I'll be looking very much the support of all member states in order to find compromises and to find concrete solutions, as I did for COP24, as I did for International Energy Agency 2019 ministerial, to find concrete solutions on which OECD will develop and implement concrete solutions.
Right, very interesting. I wanted to go back a little bit to the problem of poor public finances that we will probably see once the pandemic is over. Public finances will be in bad shape, also in OECD. How serious a problem you think that is and can be for the world economy, and what role you think the OECD should play in dealing with this challenge?
Well, I think that combining public and private financing for unprecedented challenges that we are facing is absolutely key. And we already see major economies to declare nearly $12 trillion, $12,000 billion for recovery packages and recovery measures post-COVID. This will certainly very much impact ability of in terms of fiscal policy of member states. And we are already at the historical high levels in terms of debt for countries. But I think that we should be able to go to take very simply the situation as it is. We cannot avoid right now of having public money to serve as the trigger to restart economic activity, and we should make sure that the fiscal measures are not stopping it, but it's also an opportunity to rethink and to rethink fiscal systems and to make sure that we can enhance fiscal policies, that we can bring structural reforms. And OECD is strong with its recommendations to member states, so that the recovery will be happening in a most fiscally friendly manner, if I may say. And I believe also that we should make sure to really streamline all this $12 trillion in a way which will be job rich and which will create new wealth for OECD member states and, in fact, for the world economy. If we put our bets rightly, then we will have new jobs, then we will have new sectors of activity, and then paying the debt which we right now accumulate with COVID-19 will be easier.
We have questions that relate to this from our audience, but before I move to those, I still have a couple of questions on my own. And you mentioned cooperation with non-OECD non-OECD states earlier, but I wanted to specifically ask you about something that you write or you've presented in front of the OECD. And there you mentioned that an idea to create a structure where non-member countries will be sharing their perspectives and receiving access to OECD's resources without necessarily considering membership option immediately, but upon reciprocity of costs and benefits. And I wonder how this relates to countries such as China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Russia. Could you elaborate what you mean by this proposal?
The OECD is first and foremost a community that has a very strong identity based on market economy, democracy, and ambition to have its policies based on expertise, evidence-based policies as much as possible. And the OECD cannot resign from these values under the pressure of, so to speak, competing models of governance. The role of the organization is very important in this context, as the capacity to defend our common heritage that after all aims at having more inclusive, better systems that work for the people has been under question. Our standards and our policy recommendations can be conducive to creating a wide alliance of nations that stands firm in protecting what is dear to them.
Okay, I have a personal question also. It's a semi-personal question. It's about your candidacy for the position of the Secretary General of the OECD. We have now 10 candidates for this position, as far as I understand. I assume that it requires a strong conviction that you're the best candidate for that position. So why are you the best candidate to be the Secretary General of the OECD, and what makes you different from others?
That's a very tricky question. Thank you very much, Patricia, for this one. Well, I'm very proud, of course, to be among the 10 candidates, and I recognize all merits of all other 9 candidates. And I think it's also a recognition of the role that OECD plays in today's world. But right now, I think that this sustainability challenge is at the heart of the recovery process. And I had the pleasure to be the first ever Minister of Climate in the Polish government. I had the pleasure and the honor to serve as President of COP24, which delivered an outstanding result in Katowice 2 years ago in December 2018. I had also the opportunity to run International Energy Agency Ministerial, which delivered for the first time in 10 years a ministerial communiqué in last December. And I think that this capacity of consensus building based on evidence and ability to get deep into issues that we are discussing and which are at the heart of this new sustainability challenge will be absolutely of critical importance. And I think also that OECD can and should play the role of this guiding force for member states to sail on very turbulent waters after the COVID-19 pandemic. And this ability of proven international leadership, ability to put everybody around the table to turn words into actions will be of utmost importance. I'll be very happy as well to work for the purpose of making OECD an organization which will be even more efficient than it is today. It is well recognized in the world for the quality of its experts, for outstanding human potential it has. And we can make this human potential work for the purpose of member states in the future. And I think that running such a big organization requires also a lot of experience. In my present role and my previous roles in the government, I had this opportunity to run very big organizations. And I know how challenging it is, but I know also how rewarding it is if we succeed for our member states and if we have also a great team behind.
From my own analytical perspective, as someone working at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, I can only corroborate what you're saying about the quality of material that the OECD produces. It's unmatched. And we very often use in our analytical work OECD's publications. So building on your plan to be the Secretary General, what would be your first 3 decisions? It's a banal question, maybe sort of a childish one, but I guess it might be interesting what you plan on doing, or maybe how you see your first 100 days in office.
Patrycja, it's a little bit tricky question because Secretary General starts at the 1st of June. And so the first 100 days are immediately on the holidays period. But I'll be very happy, of course, to work immediately on the challenges that we have spotted. And I think there is urgency in tackling them really, really quickly. And my success, frankly speaking, will be the success of member states, the success of their recovery plan. Because right now, this is the most pressing, this is the most challenging. Rebuild trust and confidence and put back on track our economy and our society, our economies and our societies on track for new growth. We can do that, but we have to work relentlessly from the beginning, putting environmental, sustainable, green, resilient climate policy at the heart, putting new digital technologies at the heart, and working very hard with the organization in order to understand it and to make sure that we can provide even more value added to member states from this organization. This is a very dense agenda for 100 days. And we should be first listening also to member states. It's a member-driven organization. During my career, I had experienced how important it is to get immediately very close with member states, to get their feeling and to move forward the organization in this direction that I believe it's the responsibility of Secretary General, it's the responsibility of OECD to propose to member states. So climate, digital organization.
Digital climate organization, that can be actually a one thing. Well, I think that it might be interesting to still ask you about the Polish perspective and what you still plan on doing as the Minister of Climate and Environment. And we have a couple of questions from the audience about that too, which are very straightforward and to the point. Let me maybe start by asking you this. Would you agree, as one of our viewers is asking, would you agree that any new international trade agreement should be based on compliance with environmental, biodiversity, climate, and health objectives?
Well, we should be able to make sure that at OECD we can agree upon what does it mean in practical terms. But I think that there is a growing alignment among OECD member states that this is these are the principles which should guide us. I'll be, of course, participating in terms of OECD with other organizations. We are speaking about United Nations, UNFCCC, about trade agreements. That's the responsibility of also World Trade Organization. But we can, as OECD, bring rules which we develop together as the basis, as the funding guiding principles for these agreements.
Mm-hmm. Building on this, would you agree that all new investment in fossil fuels should stop?
Well, major economies already declared that they are looking for climate neutrality by 2050. It has been the case of the European Union first, but then we had the announcement recently of climate neutrality by the government of Japan and followed by the government of Korea. We have also heard from the major emitter, which is China, the declaration to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. All this implies that the extraction of fossil fuels is stopped before. So I think that we are heading in this direction.
So I want to draw you out a little bit on this, because actually research shows both that on the top-down and bottom-up process, in the processes top-down and bottom-up, there might be a reversal when it comes to curbing climate change after the pandemic, because there'll be intensified production. And, you know, there's this mindset of we need to cross the desert first, and then we'll think about the environment. So this is the top-down approach. And then bottom-up, the individual attitude, the attitude of an individual to environmental issues tends to, this is what research shows, the concern tends to decline once an individual faces an existential threat, such as a contagious disease. So people will not care all that much for climate change. And so the risk is, what I'm trying to say is that the risk is that there's going to be a backlash. Despite people's concerns about climate, there's going to be an economic backlash and increased production that will really jeopardize the green reforms that you're talking about that are necessary. Is there, do you have a remedy for that, or you're not all that concerned about this trend?
This is not what data shows us. International Energy Agency has just published a report showing that energy consumption is expected to decline by 5 to even more percentage points in 2020 compared with 2019. That's 7 times more than the decline after 2008 financial crisis. And this decline hits mostly fossil fuels, coal, oil, and to a lesser extent gas. But renewables is the only source of power which is growing in terms of consumption. So this is not what the data shows for now. But of course, what we can see is that there might be some transitional solutions which will be necessary. And for example, moving with heating directly from coal, let's say, to renewables is extremely complicated in terms of technology, in terms of economics. So a transitional solution with gas is very much needed. So we have to foresee such transitional solutions. But at the same time, we have an unprecedented opportunity with recovery plans to put the money on technologies which will be bringing us closer to the objectives which are shared by all member states, OECD member states. And if we cannot do it now, then my question is when we will do it. And of course, it needs to be done also taking into account social impact. It's easy to say we need to go this or that direction in terms of technologies, but it can have also a fiscal impact. And it's up to OECD also to guide countries in order to see which social groups, societal groups will be the most impacted, and thus what kind of measures should be done in order to help them, to protect them on the way to more stringent environmental laws and to climate neutrality.
We have another question about the United States. Does the change in administration, which is expected in the US matter for the values and the OECD?
Well, I think that OECD is one of the most important economic body in the world, but it's also probably one of the most important multilateral body. And we need to make sure that all member states are putting all their efforts in order to make this tool working to the level it can in terms of potentiality. So I'm looking very much forward to work together with all member states and looking for truly consensual leadership.
So if you allow me, I should move to Poland and ask you a couple of questions from our own small background and backyard. When do you expect Poland to move away from coal?
Well, we have just been working on that together with mining trade unions, and framework agreement has been signed, which foresees that by 2049, all coal mines of the biggest Polish coal mine utility will be phased out. And it's a very important step, which is right now being translated into a more detailed, more operational agreement, which is being discussed between the government and mining trade unions. We expect the results of this by 15th of December, so we will have still a chance to discuss about it.
All right. And yet another question about your plans while you're still the Minister of Climate and Environment. What decisions are you still planning to take as a minister?
Well, I'm working very hard in order to implement new Polish energy policy, which is bringing completely new pillars to the development of Polish energy policy. First of all, building a new zero-emission energy system in the coming 20 years of the size and magnitude of the existing conventional one. That's an enormous investment challenge. It needs to be prepared, and all laws linked with, right now we are discussing the offshore wind act at the government, should be put in place in order to make this transition possible. But we are also seeking an enormous potential of development from bottom up in terms of democratization of energy policy. Over last 6 months in Polish energy system, more than 100,000 households installed a rooftop PV on their house. And we need to make sure that this is contributed to energy security, and this bottom-up energy security, where we combine local production of electricity, but also local storage of electricity, and thus opening completely new opportunities with hydrogen, with lithium-ion batteries, with energy clusters, with self-balancing regions, is a reform that we are working on in order to help facilitate the integration of renewables in the system, and thus making sure that this system will be taking off and building energy security, providing energy security for the economy.
I myself, I have a photovoltaic installation on my rooftop in the middle of Warsaw. We're just hoping for better conditions of usage, but obviously that's something for the future. So you talked about your decisions when it comes to energy. Any decisions when it comes to biodiversity?
Well, we have just agreed in the European Council, ENVI Council, on biodiversity conclusions. And indeed, that's one of the topics which we cherish very much here as well. And we are working on a reform of national parks in order to facilitate the financing of national parks, especially that right now with COVID, also tourism has been hit And we need to make sure that this precious heritage is preserved and is left untouched for next generations.
Mr. Minister, we have 3 minutes left and 2 questions from the audience still. Why does the Polish government promote waste incineration instead of recycling, if that is true?
Well, it is. I think it should be completely changed in terms of the way it is perceived. First of all, the recycling is the basic objective of waste management policy here in Poland. But we cannot foresee it completely outside of the existing system. And the particularity of the Polish system is that there is more than 500 centralized heating systems. And these heating systems needs to be enhanced, needs to be completely transformed from coal to new technologies. And so there is a discussion about multi-fuel reactors, which can be fueled with biomass, but when it is possible and necessary, if it is necessary, it can be also serving for waste. So I think that we are making all our utmost in order to move forward with waste management, and the biggest pillar that we are right now implementing is enhanced producers' responsibility. So to put on the shoulders of producer of the good the responsibility to look after the packaging to the end, and also pay for the cost of recycling and reusing of this packaging. That is the core of our policy right now.
So maybe finally, quick thoughts on OECD EU relations. Do you have, this is also a question from the audience, do you have anything to say about those relations?
Well, OECD needs to recognize changing patterns of the world economy. And so we have a growing importance of Asia. So this is in the interest of OECD, but it's in the interest also of European Union. Of course, there is a transatlantic also dimension, which is extremely important. As I can see, a majority of candidates for the position of Secretary General right now are coming from European countries to the position of Secretary General of OECD. And it's the recognition, I think, of the importance for Europe, but also for European Union of OECD. So I look forward to bring all these words together.
I think it's a great note to end on, but I just wanted to say by way of a conclusion that I think we've covered an immense amount of material. We went from waste incineration to US-Chinese relations, which is actually the broad portfolio of the OECD and the issues that you as Secretary General will have to take care of. Mr. Minister, thank you very much. I don't know if you would want to conclude on your own and say something to our viewers. If so, please do.
Well, I'm very grateful for this discussion. I think it's an important manner of engaging into the discussion with member states, but also with the community around OECD, in order to make it really a place where consensual solution can be brought together for the sake of OECD member states, but also for world's economy and society.
Mr. Minister, being a Pole, I wish you good luck and fingers crossed. Thank you for your time with us. Thanks to our audience for such interest in what we are talking about. And we invite you to our future seminars. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you very much. You too, Patricia. Thank you very much, Patricia and Damian. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.